It's time for us to do something.
Let's talk about the reality-detached pathology which plagues the radical left. I and many others use the term leftist to distinguish it from lefties, to describe the extremists who have little regard for the real world, science, or even humanity. Their highest good is control, regardless of who gets hurt, what damage is done, or what economic carnage is left in the trail of their failed revolutions. They have no desire to improve anything, only to control everything. Bigger government is always good, and there is no such thing as too big in their benighted vision of society. Thus, generational welfare dependency, which creates families dependent on government instead of fathers, and with fatherlessness fosters resultant higher rates of teen pregnancy, substance abuse, crime, incarceration, high school dropouts, career failure, marriage failure, and more. Doesn't matter to them because it can't enter their mind that government was part of the problem and not the solution after all. They dare not consider reducing government handouts because that is the only way they can manipulate undecided voters to support their lust for power. More and more spending, more and more social problems, more and more government to solve the problems more government created or exacerbated. And so it is with the climate cult. No matter how badly the environment must be raped to construct wind or solar energy resources, the goal was never environmental net benefit, but control. They want to control the policy, to what end matters not as long as it is theirs. They demand control of the debate, and science has nothing to do with it if the science does not conform to their preferred policy. And again with human rights, they demand science dictate policies to preserve life from the Wuhan flu, but refuse transparency of the science, lest some equally or better qualified experts expose flawed modelling, invalid assumptions, misdirected attention to irrelevant statistics, and scant consideration for the public health disasters created by singular fixation on eliminating yet another seasonal virus, always no matter the greater cost. Meanwhile, the same governments are obsessed with killing living humans and calling it healthcare, despite the science and objective medical ethics internationally agreed to in the 1940s. They promote suicide prevention and then promote laws saying how dignified and compassionate it is to help someone kill themselves. In Victoria, this year, an elderly lady diagnosed with cancer, lonely from prolonged lockdown isolation, and in zero pain, availed herself of the radical left's suicide promotion liberalisation. She died from an acutely toxic case of radical leftist government. Leftists don't want to make things better. They just want to control your life and liberty. They undefined marriage because they didn't control it, but wanted to. With that radical rewriting of the dictionary, they ushered in an Orwellian era 2/5 of Aussies saw coming when they voted no. Leftists fall over themselves and their self-contradicting search for the ultimate victims. Once upon a time, feminism was about equality of the sexes, and then the leftists got their grubby little hands on it. Success in making it illegal to pay women less for identical work or disenfranchise women from politics wasn't enough, because complete solutions to old problems are simply an inconvenient obstacle to the streams of taxpayers' money financing the grievance industry. But leftists have abandoned women. Women are now just as bad as men because they're not pathologically confused about their gender. Women are no longer deserving of the faux compassion the radical left once offered them. Now women who object to men in dresses, who simply say they feel like a woman and thus demand entry into women's toilets and change rooms at sporting facilities, are the enemy. It is they who have a pathological condition known as a phobia. Another word the radical left has undefined and manipulated to the point of absolute meaninglessness. Radical leftist Stephen King once tweeted, "I believe trans women are women. I do not believe that hate speech and shaming speech are acceptable. Those things are the enemy of rational discourse. Treat even those with whom you disagree with the dignity you expect yourself." Well, that last part I agree with. But what's actually true is that blatantly anti-science lies are the enemy of rational discourse. Personally, I expect people who love me to tell me the truth, for better or for worse. That's the dignity I expect. Those who hate me would just tell me what I want to hear for fear of offending me, and that would be embarrassing. Make no mistake from the conviction of my message that I lack any compassion for gender-confused people. I wish them the best of physical and mental health. Gender dysphoria needs compassionate treatment of the whole person, not patronising platitudes. Leftist faux compassion has multiplied the suffering to the point of being a culturally constructed epidemic, according to the nation's leading paediatricians. This week, the Mayor of Perth said the entirely uncontroversial truth that men have a penis and women have a vagina, and you don't get to swap. It's biology, it's science, it's immutable fact. Unless you're a leftist. Now let's have a look at the proceeds of how that went down in the media.
Now, the world's first LGBTQ plus boxing tournament is set to be staged in Sydney in 2023 after the nation's governing body threw its support behind the proposal. There's a woman in the paper today, a model of some description, who's having a child, and she said, they asked her, is she having a boy or a girl? And she said, I won't know that until the child turns 18.
Right.
And then they can identify themselves as a boy or a girl.
But Steve,
how do you get through until you're 18 by doing that?
Yeah, but if the child's got an old fella, that's going to make it a little difficult if that person's trying to get into the ladies' cubicles and the like. I mean, at school, I don't know that they're going to be
Well,
that
that's
happy.
the new era, Dazzle. Get into it. It's the new era. If I subscribe to being a girl, I'm a girl.
No, you don't. No, wrong.
No.
If you've got
You're
a penis,
either male
exactly,
or you're female.
if you've got a penis, mate, you're a bloke. If you've got a vagina, you're a woman.
Not necessarily.
Game over.
No, it's not game over.
Well, mate, you want to go softy, lefty?
I'm not going softy or lefty.
Penis and
namby-pamby.
vagina.
I am just saying what others...
Well, softy lefty is exactly what it was. Those comments on radio got the new mayor of Perth in massive trouble. And to the great disappointment of conservatives everywhere, he's walked back the statements and apologised for telling the truth. Sadly, he's caved like a coward and compromised. He's compromised the truth to shield himself and his now entirely meaningless political career from the ferocity of the leftist fascists who will destroy your life if you refuse to conform to their agenda. Women have women's sport because they aren't as good as men at it, generally. If they were, they wouldn't need a separate competition. They'd simply qualify to play on the various men's teams. It takes conservatives with real compassion for the real-world impacts of public policy to protect women both from being undefined and from the dangers of the appropriation of their biological uniqueness by confused men. I've got another clip here that I'm going to show you.
Was asked for advice on whether sports should allow males to play women's competitions, why wasn't their first question, is that fair for female competitors? Is that fair for women? After all, it's no secret that males enjoy significant physical advantages over women and girls. 10,000 males have run faster than the current Olympic female 100-metre champion. Male weightlifters in the 69 kilo category outlift women in the 108 kilo category. Men hit a golf ball much further and serve a tennis ball much faster. In contact sports, men on average have much greater mass, power and speed, which cause collisions with greater force and impact. That's why, when looking at the issue of transgender inclusion, World Rugby turned to the science. They found that it is neither safe nor fair for biological males to play women's rugby. Why then, when facing the same considerations, did Sport Australia produce a document which by their own admission didn't even attempt to assess scientifically whether it's safe and fair for males to play women's sport? Why did Australia's peak sporting agency avoid answering these questions and instead delegate the task of providing advice on who should play women's sport to the Human Rights Commission? Why do the guidelines, instead of providing accurate advice on the law, actually mislead sporting clubs and give them the impression they'll be sued for discrimination if they refuse a male from competing in a women's competition? Expert legal advice provided to me by a prominent QC describes how Sport Australia's guidelines misrepresent the Sex Discrimination Act, which very specifically provides for female-only sport. Over the last 12 months, I've been attempting to find out why Sport Australia didn't do the obvious and affirm what common sense, science and the law all stipulate, that women are entitled to their own sports. Myself and women right across the country who have been trying to get answers have been stonewalled and provided with spin and contradiction rather than facts. Here's what we do know. Sport Australia refuses outright to say who was consulted on the guidelines or which groups requested their development. Lobby groups fighting for biological males to be able to play women's sport were engaged to advise on the guidelines, while women's groups were not invited to participate. Sport Australia delegated the writing of the guidelines to the Human Rights Commission without providing any brief to consider scientific research relevant to safety and fairness in women's sport. After I continued to ask questions, Sport Australia conceded their guidelines were never intended to be a scientific document. Despite admitting they never looked at the science, the guidelines somehow conclude that there is limited science available, even though World Rugby cite 49 scientific reports in their analysis. Sport Australia has conceded World Rugby's findings of a potential 30% increase in head injury risk to women when playing against trans women may be correct, but refuse to reconsider their own guidelines in light of these findings. They seem to suggest we need to see some more women getting head injuries before they reconsider their actions.
It's a shame.
Rugby Australia ignored World Rugby's findings when they recently published their own transgender guidelines, allowing biological males to play full contact rugby against women. Rugby Australia's guidelines acknowledge they draw heavily on Sport Australia's science-free guidelines. We also know claimed credit for Rugby Australia and other major Australian sports recently releasing their own guidelines that promote the inclusion of men in women's sport. And we know that the interpretation of Commonwealth law and the guidelines, which Sport Australia has said is the sole purpose of the document, is misleading according to legal experts and fails to make clear that the vast majority of sports are entitled to limit their women's competitions to females. What we have, in short, is a set of guidelines impacting on women's sport that women weren't consulted about, that its creators admit are not based in science, and that legal experts say are predicated on an inaccurate interpretation of the law. It is simply unacceptable for Australia's taxpayer-funded peak sporting body to have conspired in secret with favoured lobby groups to undermine the integrity, safety and fairness of women's sport. Australians know that men and women are physically different. They know that this is why women's sport exists. And they know it is not fair and not safe for women to lose the right to their own sports on the basis of a murky, secretive, unscientific deal between bureaucrats and lobbyists.
Camera should we be looking at?
Well, the world has gone mad. How on earth is it not patently obvious to every person capable of breathing without thinking about it that letting biological men play contact sport with women is fundamentally unsafe? No matter how much surgery or makeup you have, you're a dude. Someone who has taken up the fight for truth, as we've just seen, and reality on behalf of sporting women and helping to keep women's sport safe and fair is Senator Claire Chandler from Tasmania. Claire, thank you so much for joining Pellowe Talk Live tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
I've got Jordan Peterson playing in the background, the beauties of live TV. And thank you very much for speaking out on behalf of common sense and trying to get government guidelines for the grassroots sporting clubs around Australia to actually represent reality, both the science, biology and legal aspects that we should be operating with full knowledge of.
Look, I absolutely agree, particularly on that first point. I mean, what I have been fighting for is a common sense point of view that the majority of Australians share, which is that women's sport should be for biological women. And there are very genuine and real reasons why that's the case. In the speech of mine that you just played back, I talked about the fact that something like 10,000 more men can run as fast over 100 metres as the fastest woman in the world. I mean,
That's an incredible statistic.
It is an incredible statistic. And you think about it, if we didn't have men's and women's sport at the Olympics, for example, that means that we would never see a woman competing in the 100 metres. I mean, we would never see a woman making an Olympic team in any country, I suspect, if 10,000 men can run faster than her. So there are real fairness risks here. But one of the greater concerns, I think, particularly at the community level, is the safety concern as well. And this was what first sparked my issue in this entire, my interest rather in this entire issue was back when I first became a senator almost 18 months ago, shortly before I took my seat in the Senate, Sport Australia had issued these transgender inclusion guidelines, and I received email after email from parents, women across Australia who were all concerned about the impact that this was going to have, whether it was on their own personal ability to compete in women's sport or often in their young daughter's ability to compete in her local sporting league as well. So this has been an issue that's been bubbling away for quite some time.
Well, it is, and I'm not surprised. You got lots of really, really great feedback from lots of people. I believe the majority of Australians are right-thinking, sensible people who want leadership in the real issues that are affecting Australians and against the fight against reality, which is being mounted by the left. Now, also joining us tonight on the panel of experts are Bernard Gaynor. Welcome to Pellowe Talk Live, Bernie.
G'day, Dave, and g'day, Senator Chandler. It is an honour to be on with you tonight.
Thanks, Bernard. Nice to meet you.
And also joining us is Lyle Shelton here in the studio. Lyle, so great. Welcome.
Thank you, Dave. Great to be with you, and great to be with you too, Senator, and with you also, Bernie.
So, hang on, we do have us all there. Good. I was looking for 4 squares on this little screen, but we've got 4 people that'll have to do for us. Senator Chandler, where did the wheels start falling off? When did this peak sporting, is it Sport Australia, the name of the organisation?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So when did Sport Australia start pushing back, start falling over their words, start contradicting themselves?
It's a bit of a funny one to untangle. I first started asking questions of Sport Australia about the transgender inclusion guidelines back in February. And at that point in time, I just asked basic questions around, who was consulted when the guidelines were being developed, what was the nature of the consultation. And they and the Australian Human Rights Commission, who they worked with to develop the guidelines, both said that the consultation was conducted on a confidential basis and they weren't going to tell me who that was, which I thought was incredibly surprising, particularly when you have, like I said, women across the country, parents across the country contacting me saying, where have these guidelines come from? Why is Sport Australia doing this, and it all just started to get progressively murkier from there. I mean, more recently at estimates, both Sport Australia and the AHRC have very much focused their language on the fact that these guidelines were only really designed, apparently, as I alluded to in my speech, as an interpretive legal document to assist sporting clubs know their responsibilities and their duties under the Sex Discrimination Act. And yet the guidelines clearly set out that sporting clubs should be allowing people to compete in the sporting division of the sex, rather the gender they identify with, rather than their biological sex. And I just don't understand why the starting position, if that is the question that you want to answer, isn't, will this be fair for the hundreds of thousands, most likely millions of Australian women who play sport in some form or another? So it's been a very confusing process that Sport Australia and the AHRC have gone through. They're now sort of passing the buck, and one's saying that it was the other that led the consultation, which is all a little bit confusing. But I will certainly continue to keep asking questions because, I mean, honestly, I think we are now at the point where it's clear that the science wasn't considered when the guidelines were first developed and they need to be rewritten. I should have said the other significant thing that happened in the middle of all this was a few months ago, World Rugby, the world governing organisation for rugby, decided to develop their own research. So they, when they were looking at the question of whether or not how to include transgender people in sport and whether trans women should be included in women's sport, they started from the scientific position and said, well, let's figure out whether or not it's fair, let's figure out whether or not it's safe. And they came up with dozens of scientific reports and research that all says that it clearly is neither fair nor safe. So that was the other piece of research that dropped, I guess, during my advocacy on this issue. And again, I put questions to Sport Australia and the AHRC at estimates around this, and they just don't want to recognise the truth in the research, which I'm sure for every fair-minded Australian is a pretty upsetting position for us to be in.
Lyle, doesn't it just go against the whole nature of what people play sport for? There's rules, there's guidelines, you want a level playing field, you want to be matched against people. We've got age groups in junior sports, and we've got men's but isn't it just the simple principle of sport that you're after fairness?
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. And Senator, can I just say how much, as a father of daughter and as an uncle of beautiful little nieces, how much I appreciate your advocacy on this. And Dave, you're exactly right. The whole idea of sport is that there are boundaries, there's guidelines, each sport has different rules. That's what makes it fun. The fact that not anything goes happens, the fact that there's parameters and guidelines, and in the case of gender, to make it fun and competitive, we separate ourselves, male and female, so that women can enjoy sport in a way that they can, where they can't if there's blokes bashing them about, we've all played mixed netball and touch rugby and that sort of thing, and that's all well and good. But competitive sport where women want to compete, they should be allowed to, and the Senator is quite right to be pointing this out. And David, I'll just make one point, and this may come up further in the discussion, but during the 2017 marriage plebiscite, we warned that this would happen. If you degender marriage, take away the gender requirement and the gender diversity out of marriage, that has implications for biology and family. And we said that this would lead to pressure to allow men who want to identify as women to be in women's change rooms. It was happening overseas already. It was a precursor to this. So everything that the Senator is fighting against was entirely predictable. We did predict it. And we were told that by the same-sex marriage lobby that we were talking about red herrings and furphies. And I feel like a bear with a sore head because we're in a mess as a country where we can't even recognise whether we're Arthur or Martha, male or female. And that might be a little bit cute, but I just think about my nieces and my daughter and all women in Australia who just want a fair go.
It was highly predicted. It was always going to to be this way, and it was always said exactly as you said. Let's have a. I actually want to read the actual legislation that these sporting guidelines are meant to advise about, and as the well qualified legal advice that Senator Chandler has obtained confirms, the guidelines from Sporting Australia are completely misinforming the sporting clubs in Australia about the risks and liabilities of normal, reasonable discrimination. So the Section 42 of the Sex Discrimination Act 1984, which is all about providing for female-only sport. These are the exact words. Nothing in Division 1 or 2 renders it unlawful to discriminate on the ground of sex, gender identity, or intersex status by excluding persons from participation in any competitive sporting activity in which the strength, stamina, or physique of competitors is relevant. Subsection 1 does not apply in relation to the exclusion of persons from participation in the coaching of persons engaged in any sporting activity, the umpiring or refereeing of any sporting activity, the administration of any sporting activity, any prescribed sporting activity, or sporting activities by children who have not yet attained the age of 12 years old. I don't know why that would be complicated. I know it's in legal legislation language, but Bernie, is that in the least bit ambiguous to you?
It's not ambiguous, Dave. Sorry, I was just looking at the Sex Discrimination Act because there's another section after that which has just been repealed, and I think it goes to part of the issue here. We have got completely mixed up ideas of gender, and the section that followed that related to the Commonwealth's ability to discriminate against women for combat duties. That section is now being repealed, which means that we're talking about women being hurt by men who are pretending to be women on the sporting field. Well, the Commonwealth is saying that women should be competing against men on the battlefield at the same time. I mean, it's just completely mixed up. And we talk about science. I don't think there is really any science at all behind this entire debate. You can't have this debate unless you throw common sense out the window entirely. It's just a ridiculous debate. And I think that's one of the reasons why Australians are so, I think, hesitant to speak about this. It's not just the fact that you could end up in front of a Tasmanian anti-discrimination commissioner like Senator Chandler has, or like Lyle and myself have. It's because most Australians find this whole topic so ridiculous. They feel almost that if they even enter into it, that somehow they're giving credence to stupidity. So there's. I just wanted to put that out there.
That's a good point.
It's a good point. Well made. And it does obviously, I guess, create some extra questions about the defence ability. Is that a little bit too much political correctness again? That's probably a slightly different topic.
It's a different topic, I know.
About that. But Senator Chandler, do you want to have a brief comment on that?
I think the other interesting thing to note with the Sex Discrimination Act, and particularly with the sport exemption, is before the Labor Green government of the early noughties, the Sex Discrimination Act only related to, funnily enough, discrimination on the basis of sex. So the sport exemption, as it once existed, effectively said you are allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex for sporting competitions where strength, stamina and physique are relevant. In the dying days of the Labor Green government in mid-2013, the words gender and gender identity were inserted into the Sex Discrimination Act, basically wherever it also said sex, which is where the waters got significantly muddier and, a situation that's given rise to the need to have these guidelines, it would appear. But, I mean, in that situation where sex, gender and gender identity are all attributes that are listed in the sport exemption. I don't think there's anything in that exemption that says that you can't discriminate on the basis of sex for the purpose of sport, as long as strength, stamina and physique are relevant. And honestly, I'm struggling to think of a sport where strength, stamina and physique aren't relevant, and where males wouldn't, by virtue of nature and biology, have a significant advantage over women. So as I referred to in my speech, I mean, I clearly think that the Sex Discrimination Act says something contrary to what Sport Australia and the Australian Human Rights Commission have read in when they've developed these guidelines.
Can I just ask, Senator, just you mentioned sort of the origin of these guidelines coming from Sport Australia and the Australian Human Rights Commission. I understand that they were the architect of this. I first became aware of it when the Sports Minister, Richard Colbeck, was reported in The Australian as having launched them. Can you just clear up this issue? Are these the Morrison government's guidelines, or are they quite independent? And if they're not the government's, why can't the government just say to Sport Australia, we're not going to go down this path. We're going to believe in biology and science, and we're going to allow women to enjoy their sport without this sort of confusion and risk element being brought into it.
Good question.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a tricky one for me, in that, like I said when I was talking about the history of this issue, I started as a senator just after these guidelines were introduced. So I'm not entirely sure of the background that came around to creating them, but as you've shown, I've been pretty vocal on these issues for the last 12 or so months, and I've certainly been having conversations with many colleagues about my concerns around these guidelines, and trying to figure out what can be done so that we strike a more sensible balance. But like I say, I think the onus really is on Sport Australia at this point in time, where they've publicly said that they didn't look at all of the science. That wasn't what the process was, that they and or the AHRC, depending on who you're talking to, initiated, was meant to be about. So I think they need to go back to the drawing board.
Can the government withdraw funding from Sport Australia if they don't fix this situation, so that women can enjoy their sport again without this sort of risk and liability?
It is a huge liability.
Look, I think that would be a conversation for further down the track. My absolute priority at the moment is making sure that these guidelines get rewritten as the first port of call, so that it doesn't have to get to that point. But I mean, it does pose an interesting question, particularly thinking about how much money all levels of government, state, federal and local, have invested in women's sporting facilities across the country, so that we could get more women involved in sport, so that women would feel welcome joining a sporting club and having their own facilities to use, and having their own bathrooms to change in and the like. So why have we done that on the one hand, which I think is a perfectly admirable thing to do, and on the other we have the peak sporting body in this country saying, oh well, at the same time, if a bloke wants to come and play in the women's sporting team, then they're allowed to. It's a little confusing.
If a woman is harmed in sport while this is being cleared up, who's liable? Is Sport Australia the sporting club? Is it possible there could be an action against the federal government?
I think it would fundamentally depend on where that injury might occur, whether or not it was on the professional sporting field or on a community sporting field. So, and where it happened and that sort of thing. But look, I don't think that it would be the case that the federal government would be liable. But like I say, Sport Australia needs to take the lead here. Sport Australia needs to set the standard.
Is Sport Australia actually a government body, or is it a private, independent, peak body association?
It would be a government entity or a standalone commission. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what the legal structure is, but they appear before us at estimates, which gives me the very privileged opportunity to be able to ask them the hard questions.
Yeah, good. And thank you for the hard questions you are asking.
Can I ask a question, Dave, of Senator Chandler on this? Senator, how likely do you think Sports Australia might be willing to change its current approach, given that if they go to what seems like common sense, they might face anti-discrimination complaints in various anti-discrimination bodies around the nation?
That is a very interesting question, and I hadn't necessarily thought about it through that particular lens. I've often thought to myself, why won't Sport Australia just change the guidelines? But I hadn't necessarily considered the possibility that they're worried about getting hauled before an anti-discrimination tribunal. I won't put thoughts into their head in that regard, but I mean, and this segues nicely into the next chapter in this story, at least what it was for me personally, was, if you are seen to be speaking up about this issue and trying to engage in a reasonable and polite debate around whether or not women should be subjected to having biological men playing their sporting competitions, then everyone apparently does run the risk that you will get hauled before your local anti-discrimination tribunal, because that's what happened to me.
Indeed it did. Now, what was the first notice you had that the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Tribunal had you in their crosshairs, that there was a case being made that they were demanding you answer to?
Yeah, it was quite amusing how it happened, really. I got a phone call at the end of a sitting week up in Canberra. It must have been around the start of September, and that was from my office down in Richmond in Tasmania, and they said, Equal Opportunity Tasmania has just called the office down here. They need you to call them back. They've got something to talk to you about. And right then, I had a pretty good idea what that conversation was going to be. But I picked up the phone to them, and they sent through a letter with the information about the complaint that had been made against me that they had accepted for investigation. And the funny thing was, as soon as they said the name of the complainant, I recognised it immediately, because he sent me a piece of correspondence to my office via email, and it was one of the only negative the only negative feedback I'd received about my advocacy on this issue. So I thought, oh yes, of course, it's this guy. And for background, what had happened was I had written a piece in the Mercury newspaper, which is the local newspaper in southern Tasmania, about, ironically enough, the importance of free speech, and referenced in that op-ed the importance of free speech, particularly as it related to this debate around women's sports and women's sex-based rights. And this constituent had emailed me and said, I could gather from the correspondence that he didn't agree with me on this point, but asked me to clarify my views. I provided a very polite response back to him, saying something along the lines of that I did understand the difference between sex and gender. That's why I said in my op-ed in the Mercury newspaper that women's sports, women's facilities and women's bathrooms are designed for biological women and should remain so. And I think that was the offending language, so to speak, under Section 17 of Tasmania's Anti-Discrimination Act, which, as I'm sure your viewers would be aware, is one of the most restrictive pieces of legislation in this country when it comes to free speech. There is a very long list of attributes upon which you are not able to say something that might offend, humiliate, or insult somebody. So found out at the end of the sitting week, and then unfortunately for me, I came home to Tassie and went into 2 weeks of quarantine at home. So it was not the most pleasant 2 weeks I've had stuck at home, not able to go outside and get any fresh air and perspective, and just thinking about this this process that had been kicked off against me. But from there, it just got progressively more and more ridiculous. I was summons to attend conciliation, which was due to happen at the start of October. When I asked if I could bring a lawyer to that conciliation hearing, I was refused. Obviously, I engaged a lawyer regardless, because when these things happen, you lawyer up, you try and find the right person to give you the right advice. And then not long before the conciliation started, Equal Opportunity Tas sent me a confidentiality agreement to sign, and I thought, nope, there is no way I'm signing that. I have advocated on this issue on the basis that we need to have this debate openly, and for me, the whole idea of going into conciliation with this person who'd complained about me and not being able to talk about it flew in the face of that, so I refused to sign. Within 24 hours, the conciliation was cancelled, and within another 24 hours of that, I found out, not by Equal Opportunity Tasmania, but by the Mercury newspaper, that the complaint had been withdrawn because the Mercury had received a media release from the complainant and called up my office asking for comment. So that is the whole sorry story summarised in just a few minutes. But the really concerning thing about the experience I had is not that it happened to me, but quite frankly that it could happen to anybody. I mean, I'm very fortunate in that I am a senator for Tasmania. I have access to parliamentary privilege. I was able, the day that I received the complaint, to go into the Senate a couple of hours later and make a speech and put the entire thing on public record, which, you know, most Australians would not have been able to do. And I had a profile that I was able to use to keep talking about the issue publicly in the meantime, because as I think I said on the day that I received the complaint, I wasn't going to be silenced. But not every Australian has access to those privileges. And I think most Australians would find themselves in the situation that I was in, where you've been served with some sort of legal correspondence saying that you have a case to answer for, and then being refused representation by your lawyer. The automatic reaction is, well, shut up and stop talking about it. And that has such a chilling effect on free speech in this country, particularly around that issue, and it just disturbs me greatly that this is what it's come to.
Yeah, look, there's so many things that are occurring to me, right? One, you're not allowed legal representation. You're bullied into signing a confidentiality agreement, so you can't even do a fundraiser and get whatever help you might need to get. This is such a star chamber, backward devolution of our justice system. It beggars belief that this kangaroo court is continued to operate like this, persecuting Australians and depriving them of natural justice in our nation. But one thing that stands out to me is that wouldn't it be fantastic if people like you, Lyle, and you, Bernie, actually could get this on the public record and had countless amounts of politicians, senators, members of lower houses who would stand up and put this on the public record and actually say every time this happens, until we just get sick of hearing it, and change the laws and change the legal environment in Australia so persecuting free speech no longer has a legal strategic advantage. Wouldn't it be great if there was an endless stream of politicians like Senator Chandler who were willing to stand up and put it on the record for the sake of everyone in their constituency?
Yeah, well, Dave, on that point, I couldn't help smiling, Claire, when you said that this could happen to anybody, and I noticed that 3 out of the 4 people on this panel have had anti-discrimination complaints in various forms. I've had 37 since 2014 from one serial activist who's said that he's doing it to try and bankrupt me. I'm really interested to find out what the Conservative coalition or Liberal state governments in Tasmania thought about the fact that one of their party senators from the state had been dragged before this tribunal, and what your federal colleagues thought about this. I mean, surely we need action taken on these anti-discrimination bodies. I think they should be bulldozed. But I think far too many Conservative politicians have just assumed that it doesn't happen to politicians. It only happens to bigots, the plebs. They're the ones that have to deal with it. But when a senator gets dragged before a tribunal, what was the reaction?
Oh, look, you only have to look at some of the comments that colleagues of mine, like Senator James Patterson, made publicly to know that there is good support within the coalition for what I said and my plight. And indeed, our Prime Minister was on 2GB radio not long after the complaint was withdrawn, describing my points of view as common sense, which I found personally heartening and very heartening for the cause as well. But I mean, at least in my own home state of Tassie, attempts were made to change the Anti-Discrimination Act a few years ago in the lead up to the same-sex marriage plebiscite. Those changes were not approved by the upper house at the time. And this goes back to the reason why I think a lot of attempts to change anti-discrimination legislation are failing. And that is because some of our parliaments are controlled by the left. And in Tasmania, the upper house is controlled by left independents. And of course, in the Senate federally, we have to contend with a crossbench as well. And the left are more than happy to continue to shut down debate around these issues. So until the left are, particularly on the issue of women's sport, which have absolutely vacated, willing to accept just how chilling the effect that these anti-discrimination acts or these pieces of legislation have on free speech, then there is only so far that we're going to be able to get. I mean, you've heard it slightly in the background of the video that you played of my recent speech at the start of one of my Labor colleagues on the other side of the chamber shouting me down. I've been labelled transphobic by Labor senators before for asking questions of estimates or making contributions in the Senate chamber. And I don't think there's anything transphobic about what I've said. What I'm advocating for is for women's sport to be for biological women. I don't think there's anything transphobic about that. But this is the rhetoric that the left uses.
It is rhetoric, and it's purely a cheap debate strategy designed to sling mud instead of engage with the substance of the argument. And it's ignorant, it's dishonest, and anybody who repeats it is intellectual coward.
Claire, could I just jump in there on this issue of the difficulty about getting law reform, as Bernie's pointed out, and you've mentioned it's because the left seem to control certainly the upper house in Tasmania. I take that point. Certainly it's difficult in the federal parliament to get change through the Senate because of the dynamics there, although I think with the crossbench common sense changes to allow free speech in these areas should be able to get through. But I just note that during the marriage plebiscite, or just after the plebiscite, when the legislation went through the Parliament in December 2017 to give effect to the vote that the people had made, and I think had made a decision based on false information. We said that degendering marriage would lead to a lot of these sort of problems. We were told that was not true. Of course, it is true, was true, is playing out right now. And so the Coalition for Marriage, of which I was a part, put up very detailed amendments to the Marriage Act to facilitate free speech. And unfortunately, it wasn't just the left that voted down those amendments for free speech. The majority of the then Turnbull cabinet voted against those free speech amendments. And so I guess my hope is that now that we are seeing the consequences play out that we said would play out, that I hope there's a change in the Liberal and National party rooms that realise just the seriousness of this, the magnitude of the change that was made in 2017 based on incorrect and false information by the Yes campaign, that perhaps these issues, we may not be able to put marriage back together, but surely we can draw a line in the sand of the radical LGBTIQA plus political agenda, which I separate from individual gay people most of whom are very generous and decent people. But the political agenda that goes behind this is what's driving the sort of problems that we are having now. And I just wonder if there's a greater awareness in the coalition party room that a line does need to be drawn in the sand if we are going to preserve free speech and common sense in this nation.
Oh, look, I certainly wouldn't speak on behalf of all of my colleagues, because I have a number of colleagues that do all have very strong feelings about free speech. But there is, as we alluded to earlier, I guess something perhaps a bit focusing that happens when it is one of your own that is dragged through one of these processes, as I was. So whether or not that has changed any attitudes, I'm not sure. But the other really interesting thing about particularly this women's sport issue is that, and, you know, we're talking about what happens on the left and what happens on the right. I have been contacted by so many Australians who say, I usually vote Labor or I usually vote Green, but on this issue, you, a Conservative or a Liberal, are the only politician standing up for this issue, and it's something that I'm willing to change my vote over. So I think the erosion of biological sex-based rights is something that transcends the political spectrum.
I'm working with a theory that there is no centre position in politics. That admittedly there's a whole bunch of undecided voters, but those are people who are looking for leadership. They're not people who necessarily believe a little bit of the left and a little bit of the right. They're actually looking for someone to prosecute a good argument, bring the facts, evidence, data and logic, and make a case for truth and ethics and right thinking in society. And I'd love to see more Conservatives like you in our federal and state parliaments who are just willing to say, boys are boys, girls and girls, this isn't rocket science complicated. Any science that offers some other wacky theory is junk science. It doesn't deserve that label at all. And the word science isn't an argument in itself. You can't just say the science says when common sense is explaining reality to us in perfectly loud language that every little boy and girl, including that famous scene from Kindergarten Cop with Arnold Schwarzenegger, this is not complicated stuff. And the radical leftists trying to just have zero relationship with reality whatsoever, and that's hopefully the political landscape in which Conservatives can stand up tall and get those people to change their votes who have been deluded and beguiled by offers of pork barrelling and emotionally manipulative language like inclusion and tolerance, which ends up in these kind of situations which are potentially harmful and certainly unfair to women, and erasing their identity altogether. And CNN using language recently to talk about women, the language was people with a cervix. Like, that was actually published language. It was just ridiculous. Lyle, you've got some bunch of stuff here.
Well, look, while
how do we
we're
segue to that? I'm not sure
I don't know.
what you've got.
Well, while we're in a philosophical mood, I've been reading about Alexander Solzhenitsyn this morning, Eric Metaxas' chapter in his brilliant book, 7 More Men. And he gave his famous Harvard lecture in 1978. Solzhenitsyn, for those who don't know, was the famous Soviet dissident, spent 8 years in a gulag for writing letters critical of Stalin. And finally he got expelled from the Soviet Union after exposing the horrors of the gulag. But then he could see that Western society was also falling apart. And it plays into the debate that we're having now, because Solzhenitsyn noted in 1978 at his Harvard lecture that the West was heading in a direction where it was unravelling. He said we'd lost courage in our society, and we weren't able to stand up for our values. And he said the loss of courage was always an indicator in ancient times that we were close to the beginning of the end. And I see in you, Senator, someone who has had rare courage to stand up, and I've been involved in this debate for more than 10 years and seen the demonisation that comes to anyone who dares to speak against this political agenda. But the courage is rare. And the other point that Solzhenitsyn made was that part of the problem in the West is that we've been so fixated with individual rights that these individual rights have reached such extremes to make society defenceless against certain individuals. And this is where I guess identity politics comes. This is 1978, before the term identity politics had even come along. So here we are talking about transgender identity, gender identity and legislation, etc. And we've put these individual rights on such a pedestal that we don't have the ability to defend human rights at all for everyone anymore. And we've lost the will and the courage to defend them. Sorry, that's a bit long and philosophical, but I just happened to be reading this morning, and I think Solzhenitsyn was a prophet as to where we are now. And if we don't find the courage to push back on this, it will be the beginning of the end.
I recently had the difficult task of publishing an article about Miss Intercontinental New Zealand. And Miss Intercontinental New Zealand is basically a beauty pageant for females. And the winner was decided to be a transgender woman. Someone who used to be a man, was born a man, and then had an operation and suffering gender dysphoria, now identifies as a woman and entered this competition. Additionally, he was born in, I think, the Philippines. But the dilemma was, how do we write the article? Because the author, James McPherson, brilliant article, and James really defended the truth and the reality of biological sex, despite the silly word games that radical leftists play. But he still wanted to use preferred pronouns. And we had a debate, and he was prepared to pull the article if I wouldn't, and I was almost prepared to not publish it if he wouldn't flex at all. We both had, I think, two valid arguments. James was really concerned about not losing the argument, or losing. He didn't want readers to lose sight of the argument that he was making, with getting lost in seemingly deliberate and excessive, provocative, biological, not using preferred pronouns, using biologically accurate pronouns. And I understood that, but at the same time, I felt, as the editor of The Good Source, we want to tell the truth. We want people to understand we're not fake news. We're all about the science and reality, facts, evidence, data, logic, and that preferred pronouns flies in the face of that objective. And we ended up, for those of you who saw the article, we ended up deciding to respect the author's wishes, but use scare quotes around the preferred pronouns, those that weren't actually reflective of biological reality. So I want to bring that to the panel now, and let's have a chat about it. Again, James, I don't want to rag out at him, but he's welcoming, of course, of us having this debate as a panel, and we spoke about it as a team, the different contributors, and how we should do that and what our standards should be. And the consensus was to essentially respect the author's wishes and maybe just have a little editor's comment at the beginning, that we were doing that deliberately, and not suggesting that those preferred pronouns were reality. Senator, can I start with you? There's a bit of wisdom that's required here to find the right balance between compassion for people that are made in God's image and equally deserving of dignity and respect when we speak both to them and about them. But we also have a commitment to uncompromising truth in politics and the media. How do you wrestle with those discussions, and maybe in our situation specifically? Do you think we should use preferred pronouns with or without scare quotes, or stick to the biological reality?
Yeah, it is a tricky issue, that one, and I guess I come at it from a position that if you want to be referred to a certain way and you request that of someone, and then that other person is within the realms of social politeness, I think, obliged to refer to you as you would like to be referred to. I mean, I wouldn't for the slightest moment try and draw a parallel here, but I'm 30 years old, and sometimes when people refer to me as Senator. I'm not entirely sure who they're talking about, but I'm much happier for people to call me Claire. Not that I'm saying that that is the same, but you ask people how you would like to be referred to. But what I don't really enjoy seeing now is this proliferation of people on Twitter or on LinkedIn or in their email signatures specifying whether they are a she, her, or a him, he, or them, they, or whatever it is that they may want to be referred to, because that's effectively compelled language. If we're living in a world where everyone feels that there is an obligation upon them to explain to someone what their gender identity is, and at the end of the day, on that basis, if someone said to me, "Oh, what pronoun would you like me to refer to you as?" I'd almost be offended that they didn't automatically assume I was female just based on the look of me. So I think if someone proactively says that they would like to be referred to a certain way, then that's, I will accept that because it is the polite and kind thing to do. But yeah, it's where the language becomes compelled or where people feel that there is an obligation upon them by their employer or by social media that I think it starts to get a little bit murky.
Yeah, I agree with you, Senator. I think politeness and consideration in human interactions is really important. I often think of Catherine Mcgregor, who I think is a brilliant public commentator and an amazing writer. Now, Catherine is probably Australia's most public person who has undergone a gender transition, and I think out of respect, I would call her by female pronouns if I was having an interaction with her. But I would want to reserve the right, if there was a public debate with her over these issues, to be able to refer to biological reality. And you do that carefully and sensitively. In the article that I wrote on my blog last January, where I talked about a woman who was identifying as a man in front of children as a role model while reading to children, I was very clear and deliberate in wanting to say what that was, because I think parents would want to know the sort of example and, I guess, indoctrination that's being presented to their children. So I think we've got to be free to have public debate, but also, I guess, balance it up with kindness in our personal interactions.
We've got a comment here from Una Persona, not using a real name or photo, saying that the headline I chose was "Foreign Dude Crowned Miss New Zealand." Not particularly polite in one person's opinion. Well, actually, I probably was going to go with "Foreign Bloke" to start with, but I talked about it with James, with the author, and we essentially debated and could have used man or male or biological male, and settled on dude as a little. The point of the story certainly was that reality was being denied, and so the headline was intended to reflect that reality, which was dissonant, and telling people that their reality perception is dissonant. I don't know that there's an exception in a polite way. Interested in everybody's opinions. I only claim to be human, and happy to do better each time. Joan White says, well said, Lyle. I'm going to come to Bernard Actually, we'll come to Bernard now, and after that, we're going to come back to some of the questions that viewers have asked. Don't forget to leave your questions in the comments section. We'd love to know what you're thinking. Share that with people, as long as it's sincere and civil. We don't want to invite trouble from the lawfare litigious left. And don't forget that if you are watching this, then that's thanks to the Good Source supporters. Good Source supporters put their hand in their pocket and come up with $5, $10 or $20 every month voluntarily. Everything's free, but they want to make sure that it stays free and stays keep coming. And we've got Bernard Gaynor and the Pellowe Talk Live on Tuesday nights, and Lyle's show most Wednesdays, although a bit of a break tomorrow. And there's more coming. There's new shows being added over the Christmas break, while some others are taking a break. And we want to keep bringing you the good source. News that's true, opinions that are honest and well argued without just simply being mean or bombastic. We want to be the alternative. We want to be the acoustic treatment to the echo chamber, which is the lying harlot, formerly known as mainstream media. The American election changed all of that. They're not even deserving of the credit of being prejudiced or biased anymore. They're just lying sellouts with no fidelity or relationship with truth whatsoever.
You're off track here, Dave.
A little off track. The good source is what we want to be, the alternative to all of those bad options. If you'd like to become a supporter, head to the website goodsource.news and just click on the donate buttons and make sure you check out all the shows and articles. Bernard, what do you think about the editorial discretion or use of personal pronouns, in which preferred pronouns, in which contexts is it justified, if ever?
Well, Dave, I have been holding myself back, trying not to jump out of my seat on this topic, because I think this whole debate, and I've got to disagree with Claire and I've got to disagree with Lyle, but the very fact that we're having a debate about whether we should use the correct pronouns for a person is symbolic of the reason why conservatives lose these battles over and over and over again. And I will make this prediction: we will never ever win the battle on transgender men in women's sport if we decide that we have to be polite and refer to them as women. The moment we refer to them as women, we have lost the debate. And the fact is, they aren't women. The very fact we use the word transgender woman highlights that they're not a woman. Now, the word he or she means something. He refers to a man, she refers to a woman. And as much as, again, it's called the preferred pronoun because it's not the real pronoun. And I don't think we can ever lose sight of that. And the moment we decide not to speak the truth, we tie our hands behind our backs legally,
so Bernard, if
socially,
Catherine Mcgregor was
politically.
here tonight, would you
McGregor
refer to
is a
Catherine
man.
as Malcolm or as Catherine?
I will refer to Catherine McGregor as a man because Catherine McGregor is a man. There's no doubt about that.
But would you call
He call
Catherine
himself-
Malcolm or would you call Catherine?
Catherine can call himself whatever he wants, but he is a man, and there is no getting around that. And it is this whole topic of politeness. Where is the consideration on the politeness or respect shown to people like you, me, Claire, everybody else to lie in our pronouns? There's no requests of or respect there. They're asking us to lie. Now a name is not the same thing as biological gender reality. People can change their name, but they are still a man or a woman. That's the reality. And the moment we decide that we're not going to use the real pronoun in order to be polite, we're going to lose the fight socially, politically, legally, every other way. And eventually we're going to be saying, oh, well, we lost that battle as well. Now let's have the fight on, kindergarten kids being taught preferred pronouns. Well, and then we're going to lose that fight too. Oh, we've got to start talking the truth.
With the silence of Dave's looking at me.
I'm waiting. You thought you had something to say. I'm just being accommodating.
I do. I'm wanting to be considerate of other panellists, and especially our senator.
Well, let me ask you, what do you think the relevance of changing the name is? Because that's not a biological reality. No,
and I think that's. I take Bernard's point. I think that's easier to call someone who's changed their name. But in essence, if you take the logic of what Bernard's saying, then you are going along with something which is a lie. I suppose the point I was making, and I think the senator was making, is we want to be polite.
I disagree with that.
But
if you change your name, you've changed your name. Plenty of people change
names.
Well,
it's still a female name though. But so you're still going along with it. But to Bernard's point,
Johnny Cash has a great song about that.
A man named Sue.
Boy named Sue.
But Bernard's quite right, because we are losing this, and I've just got legal documents in front of me, and I'm breaking some news here on Pellowe Talk Live tonight. This is yet to be published, but on Friday I received my statement of complaint from the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal, and Senator Chandler's gone through the legal process down in Tasmania, which went a step below. I've been through the process that she's gone through at the Human Rights Commission level, in her case Equal Opportunities Tasmania. In her case they backed down because of the public pressure. In my case they haven't. We failed to conciliate at the Human Rights Commission, so I'm at QCAT, and the orders that they're seeking against me in their statement of claim, pursuant to Section 209 of the Queensland Anti-Discrimination Act of 1991, is that they want to fine me or cause me to pay each of the complainants $10,000 each. That's $20,000 to each of the drag queens that's suing me for saying that they are dangerous role models to children, which they are.
Did you say they personally are, or drag queens generically?
I said, well, both, because if you put gender fluid role models in front of children, in my opinion, I think that's a dangerous role model. We have an epidemic of children presenting at gender clinics right around the nation. Going on
it is epidemic.
It's an epidemic. The numbers are an epidemic. There's in the hundreds, where we never used to see these sort of numbers at all. Children on puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, in some rare cases having double mastectomies as adolescents. This is very, very serious, and so I feel very strongly about it. I have a lot of, as I said earlier, a lot of very young nieces. But not only do they want $10,000 each out of me under the Act, by law, they want me to refrain from making, publishing or distributing any statements, information, suggestions or implications of the same or similar effect. Now this is commentary saying that biology is what it is.
Forever banned censorship.
Forever banned censorship. So that's the orders they're seeking from me as of last Friday. So I hear what Bernard's saying. If we keep pandering to this, we are going to lose, and they're going to wave documents like this in front of us, and a QCAT judge is going to make a decision on this sometime probably next year. But I find all this quite chilling. It's worrying. I can't believe that in the nation that I grew up in that I'm even facing this. I can't believe that every politician in the country isn't jumping up and down about this. I spent 10 years at ACL warning that this was going to happen. No one would believe us. They didn't believe us when the Marriage Act changed, and even, as I said earlier, some of the coalition voted against the free speech amendments which would have stopped this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And now we're dealing with it, and I feel very grieved about that, as you can probably tell, and I'm worried for the future of my country, as well as my own personal future.
Well, and can I just jump in there as well? I mean, obviously the fact that there has been a monetary penalty attached to the complaint against you, Lyle, is just crazy. But
you know, the money doesn't worry me. Well, I mean, it does worry
absolutely.
me. What worries me is that they want me to shut up. They want to censor me forever.
Exactly. And the same was the case in with the complaint against me. In the original document that the complainant filed with the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner, he requested that I make a public apology for my comments and that I never say what I said again, in effect. And this is what I mean about shutting down debate. And it's one thing for one person to go to the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commissioner and say, I don't like what Senator Chandler said and I never want her to say it again. But I think it's another thing completely for these bureaucratic, semi-judicial institutions to accept the complaint and decide to actually investigate it. I mean, I'm not sure what the case is in Queensland, but in Tasmania, the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner has the power to dismiss a complaint as vexatious if it's a he at the time, but at the moment it's a she, if she thinks that there's nothing to it. And I just think in a situation where a complaint's been made of, I don't like what you said, I don't think you should say it again. I mean, isn't that the definition of vexatious? If this complainant wanted to have a conversation with me about my views, I'm a public figure, my public email address and my public phone number are available to him. Pick up the phone and make a meeting. But that's not what these people want. They want to shut down debate.
Correct.
Hey, can I jump in here on this, please? Because I think Claire makes a great point. Claire, I don't know how much you know about my history with the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board. I have faced 37 complaints from a bloke who says it is his job to lodge complaints. That's what he does for a living. He has stated publicly he is lodging complaints to bankrupt me. It's cost me about 500 grand in legal fees. Well, not just on this issue, but in relation to LGBT complaints since 2013. The Anti-Discrimination Board of New South Wales has got that evidence where he said he's lodging complaints to bankrupt me. They have never, ever even looked at it. Instead, when they refer the matters to the tribunal in New South Wales, I don't even live in New South Wales, by the way, when they refer the matter to the New South Wales tribunal, they remove all the evidence of his emails where he states he's lodging complaints to bankrupt me or harass me, or he got my address from the electoral roll and started sending it to third parties in order to have them harass me. They don't look at any of that stuff, and they are completely biased. And I was going to ask you earlier whether you ever felt like you were going to get a fair hearing in Tasmania. And also, so I might be hogging, but I would like to ask you, you talk about, I want to ask this question. This question of sport. Now, we talk about fairness, but competitive sport is about winning. There's no doubt about that. And in female competitive sport, it's about winning. They want to win. And I understand that. I think that's a good thing. That's why people watch it. How many of the professional female athletes have spoken to you privately? And would it help the case if more of them were willing to come out publicly and express their concerns?
Sorry, I was just writing down the first question that you
it was about whether you felt like we could get a fair hearing in Tasmania. But
yeah. So certainly in a situation where I'd been denied the right to have a lawyer present for the conciliation hearing, I was starting to get, understandably a little bit nervous about that, and a little bit nervous about what conciliation would hold for me in that regard. I must say the public opinion on the complaint that was made against me was overwhelmingly positive. Once it hit the media down in Tassie, and we had a bit of coverage in the Australian newspaper as well, it certainly seemed that overwhelmingly people were on my side. So while I wasn't sure what kind of a hearing I was going to get at Equal Opportunity Tasmania, I was very confident that the people of Tasmania were on my side, which did buoy me somewhat. But I was prepared to take this complaint all the way that it would need to go, but for, of course, the fact that it was withdrawn and it didn't quite get to that. So I guess I will never know whether or not I would have received a fair trial, but in the court of public opinion, I think I had the upper hand. On the issue of professional athletes, in particular, reaching out to me, we know that some professional athletes in Australia have gone on the record to voice their concerns about the inclusion of transgender people in women's sport. Tamsin Lewis is one who has spoken out in recent months, and Jane Fleming as well. A number have contacted me privately, and I've had conversations with them on the basis that, that it wasn't going to be divulged who they were or what sport they played in. And this is, obviously an issue that is impacting athletes at the professional level, but it's also an issue that's impacting at the community level as well. I do think that if more athletes are willing to speak about this, then the issue will gain even more traction than it already has. And if people at the community level are impacted, continue to be impacted by this and speak out, then it will gain traction as well. But at the same time, I can understand why a lot of these women, whether they're the professional athletes I've spoken with, whether they're the community athletes I've spoken with, are looking at what happened to me. And now, they had reservations going public before, but they certainly have reservations now. So
it's a difficult debate to have when the women who are in the sporting field, professionally or in the community level, who agree with you, feel like they can't speak up, otherwise they might be dragged to an anti-discrimination commission.
Dragged through an anti-discrimination...
Or they might lose their jobs or their sponsorship.
Yes. Yep.
Yep.
That's what I was about to say. It's not just the threat of being dragged through an anti-discrimination commission. It is what disciplinary action might be taken against you by your sporting code or by your local club or whatever. Yep.
Senator, one of the things that have really didn't surprise me about this, but when I found myself in legal hot water, and maybe you did similar research, but I looked at the lawyers who were preparing the briefs and preparing documents like this against me, and the two drag queens that are suing me have representation from the LGBT legal service here in Queensland. Their annual report shows that organisation received $400,000 of taxpayers' money over the last 3 financial years. So not only do we have laws which are anti-free speech, but they're weaponised against public commentary, and the taxpayer pays for the weaponisation of these laws. And we really need some serious law reform so that freedom of speech can be restored in this country. People might want to disagree with what I've said or with your point of view or with Bernard's, but I didn't think growing up in Toowoomba in Queensland that free speech would ever be an issue in my lifetime. And I just can't believe the situation that we're in. I saw it coming over the last 10 years. I did my bit in my tour of duty in Canberra. We engaged legal academics. We tried to alert politicians. We tried to alert church leaders. Very few people would listen. But surely now we've got to get to the stage where we see some change in this nation, and surely we find what Solzhenitsyn was begging the West to find back in 78, and that is some courage to stand up for the things that we believe in, the things that our society was founded on. Freedom of speech, a basic freedom, basic human right, which has now been trumped by this extreme individualism that we've somehow found ourselves embroiled in.
I think one of the issues that we have with courage, though, Lyle, is that it is so easy to get shouted down or cancelled when you're operating via a keyboard and a computer screen. And that's what we see on social media. I really worry that particularly the generation like mine that's grown up with social media will struggle to find that courage because, if you put your opinion out online, then you are very quickly shouted down by the vocal left. So we need to learn how to argue and debate constructively and better than just typing a comment on Facebook and hitting enter and then thinking that that's the be all and the end all of public opinion on the matter. I think that social media has a lot to answer for the degeneration of public debate in this country as well, but that's something entirely apart from the issues that we're discussing here tonight.
No, there's no doubt about that. But the scary thing is, as Bernie's discovered, as you've discovered, and as I'm discovering, is that cancel culture has moved beyond the keyboard warriors to taxpayer-funded legal advocates who can not just cancel you with a Facebook post or a tweet, they can cancel you with an action before a tribunal and fine you. Yeah. And force you to apologise and force you to never say these things again in Australia.
And what we've got right now is the case where if you cooperate with this,
I could make this go away.
You have to pay $20,000 and promise to never speak about an issue of significant public importance, of risk to and jeopardy to children and innocent people. A important public issue. You are shut down. You're excluded from the debate. Ever again. It's way beyond keyboard warriors. And what we have is a shift of what's called the Overton window, where politicians and media have basically either cooperated or surrendered that the conversation has to shift further and further to the left until traditional family values are considered radical, offensive, and it becomes illegal and punishable to espouse traditional family values and criticise the opposite.
And Senator, that's why your stand. And I've been gone from Canberra for 3 years. I didn't know about you until you took your stance, but I can't say how much that reverberated, how much hope that gave people like me who are now private citizens again, that someone was willing to stand up against this. So I think the more of this, the more it will resonate with people out there who know in their guts that something terrible is going on in this nation when it comes to these basic freedoms that we once used to all take for granted. So thank you.
No, that very kind words, Lyle. And look, that's why I said right from the get-go when this complaint landed on my desk that it wasn't going to silence me and that I was going to keep fighting because, like you say, this lawfare has just gone too far, and people need to know that there are sensible voices out there. There are courageous voices out there that are willing to speak up and fight for these values and have the debate.
Yep.
And can I jump in there too, Dave, quickly? Claire, I'd like to say exactly this, or echo what Lyle said. When I saw your stance in the media, I was extremely encouraged. And I can only say well done, and please keep it up. We need more people like you in Parliament.
Thank you, Bernard.
Well, Lyle, you certainly won't be on your own. You very much are. We can't take any of the stress or anything off you or your family, but we can pledge absolutely we're here as much as we can, as much as I can. My voice will be lent to call for people to support you as necessary. Do you need extra donations immediately? No,
we don't. And thank you, Dave. You know, that means a lot. And our friendship and the fact that you've used the Good Source and Pellowe Talk to help highlight my case. My friendship with Bernie over the last 2 or 3 years, and you've been through this as well. So I do feel very well supported. And I appreciate, again, being able to air these things to our audience tonight, because I think the more that we talk about this, the more ridiculous it becomes to the average person. So I think it's been a helpful discussion. I'm very fortunate to have what we need to fight the first tranche of this battle. If it ends up going beyond QCAT, we'll wait and see. But,
so to be clear, you have zero intentions of cooperating with this?
I am not going to pay $20,000 to the drag queens.
And will you be silent?
I will not be apologising. I will not be taking things off my blog, and I will not refrain from commenting about women's human rights and the rights of children to be protected from harmful influences. I will not stop. And you know, Claire gives me a lot of hope because of the courage of her stand, and I think the more people who can push back on this radical political agenda, and it's not about people. I love all people. I don't have any animus towards any individuals at all. And that's the thing that grieved me about the whole gay marriage debate, because you had a difference of opinion on public policy. You were seen as a hater, a bigot. We were called that. That's not where I'm coming from. It's a disagreement over public policy and what's appropriate for children. And we should be allowed to have those disagreements in Australia without being cancelled. So I'm grateful for all the support out there, for your support and the Good Source community support. So we fight on.
Words are cheap and easy. Can I encourage viewers, contact your local MP, contact your state senator, and ask them to talk about Bernie's case and Lyle's case, and get the information from their respective blogs. There's heaps of information about Claire's battle as well. Sorry, Senator Chandler. Sorry, Claire. And it's important that we ask our politicians to speak up on our behalf, because they do have the protection of parliamentary privilege to describe the horror and the abuse of our legal system when well-meaning, nice and polite, sincere citizens try and prosecute a reasonable political argument, and they get shut down, censored, and punished by a system. Senator Chandler, I'm quite sure that with or without the resolution that you got, even going as far as it did before the complaint was withdrawn, was punishing to some extent in itself.
Absolutely. In that intervening month or so between receiving the complaint and it being withdrawn. You do have moments of self-doubt where you think, is my current stress levels worth it for the issue that I'm advocating on? And during that period of time, I was very well supported by colleagues and family and my staff in particular in my office that, I felt empowered to battle on. But it's absolutely tough, and it's not a situation I would wish on anyone.
Absolutely. Well, contact your MPs and ask them to speak up on Lyle's behalf, on Bernard's behalf, and anybody else you know of that's being targeted by LGBTIQAX plus activists who are seeking to weaponise a system that should be serving real victims, not imaginary victims who choose to be offended because of a difference of opinion. And let's face it, a adult entertainment porn industry award category is not the kind of people who should be in their full regalia and costume and character be modelling early childhood literacy. It's just dissonant. The only possible agenda for having that would be to normalise abnormal behaviour, and that's why it's relegated to the adult entertainment industry awards and not the Emmys or some other mainstream thing. This is not appropriate children's entertainment, not a circus clown, not Ronald McDonald, adult entertainment. And have that in your adult licensed venues where it's age appropriate. The age appropriate entertainment is not a new concept. But here's the thing, as you're communicating to the politicians, the goal is to give them the courage and the confidence that there's a volume of support for their voice on this issue, that you won't leave them alone at the ballot box and on election day if they put their neck on the line and speak up for traditional family Australian values. And that's super, super important. Claire, how willing would you to be, I'm going to put you on the spot here, if a person in Tasmania was dragged before the anti-discrimination tribunal and or whatever the Tasmanian name is for that particular kangaroo court, how willing, if they were in a similar context to yourself or Lyle, just making a good faith argument politically, to mention their case in Parliament and give it some profile and attention, would that be appropriate?
Oh, of course. I think if anyone's gone through a similar situation for fighting for what I've been fighting for, then I would have no reservations in talking about it publicly. Indeed, we've seen a couple of instances of that happening in Tasmania historically. I should have said at the outset, I'm by no means the first person to trip the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Act, or I should say be accused of tripping the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Act. Archbishop Julian Porteous is one of our most notable examples of, and he got a lot further through the process than I did. So I have not been the first, and I will not be the last, and I will certainly be happy to talk to anyone that might have had a similar experience in Tassie. Indeed, if any of them are listening tonight, they're more than welcome to contact me.
Thank you very much. Now, I am just trying to find a question. We're out of time, but I did offer people to ask you a question, so I want to find one and have a look at it. Okay, TPN says, Claire, what do you think the media's role in these issues are, and do you think they can be changed to be more balanced?
I think the media has a huge role to play, particularly around the transgender debate, and I absolutely think that they can be more balanced. I mean, you look at the coverage that I received during the complaint that was made against me. Bernard Lane in The Australian gave me an absolutely fantastic run, as did Matt Denham, the Tasmanian correspondent as well. I received a bit of coverage in the Mercury newspaper back in Tassie, which obviously had skin in the game because they'd printed the offending op-ed, and I went on Sky News a couple of times and spoke about it there. But there wasn't a lot of interest about the issue more broadly than that, and I think the media has a massive role to play in trying to shine a light on these issues and listen to a more diverse set of voices as well. So I would certainly like to see more media coverage of this issue, and it's one of the reasons why I keep talking about it as much as I do, because I think that if I keep talking about it, I will encourage others to talk about it, and if others talk about it, then perhaps some of our other media outlets in the country might consider covering it as well.
Awesome. Good answer. Thank you very much. Now we have a good comment here I want to share. 3 strong and courageous people tonight. You represent all of us. Thank you very much, from VJE Matthew. So it was a good panel tonight. Thank you very much to Lyle and Bernie and Senator Claire Chandler. It was great having you on. BernardGaynor.com.au, LyleShelton.com.au, and Claire, I'm taking a wild stab in the dark, ClaireChandler.com.au?
SenatorChandler.com.au.
How inappropriate of me. Senator Chandler.
That's so fine.
Thank you very much for that. And we look forward to seeing you next week on Pellowe Talk Live. We have a confirmed guest already. Australia's favourite Labor voter, except if you are a Labor voter, Joe Hildebrand, the lefty that the lefties love to hate. And so very welcome on the Good Source. So don't miss Pellowe Talk Live next week. And don't forget, there's plenty of great shows on the Good Source website. Anytime that you can watch them on delayed stream. And we look forward to seeing you there. Sign up for the newsletters, become a weekly or monthly supporter, and help us to fight fake news. We'll see you guys backstage after. Don't go away. But to those viewers right now, good night.
If not now, then when will we see an end to all this pain? Oh, it's not enough to do nothing. It's time for us to do something.